Prototype can confuse many individuals, even individuals coming from a coding background from another language. And that's because prototype in and of itself is not really that well known. It's only known because of JavaScript. JavaScript is an extremely popular language. However, a lot of people don't understand the concept of prototype, and it really isn't that complicated. It's extremely simple. You have objects. JavaScript loves objects. I don't care what you say, it absolutely adores objects. And your objects contains nouns and verbs. Properties, which are nouns, they're descriptive, and verbs, which are methods, they're functions stored within an object. Very simple, nouns and verbs. Now, what does a prototype do? Well, let's say I have two objects. One object is an apple. It resembles an apple, if you will. And what it has is a load of properties that describe that apple. And then I have another object, completely separate, that has methods. All it has is just a ton of methods in there. It can have properties as well, not a problem. But let's say, for argument's sake, it contains a few methods, a few functions stored in an object. Well, now let's say that all of those methods, all of those verbs such as eat and throw and all the rest of them can be associated with this apple object. It makes sense. I can eat the apple, I can throw the apple, and so on and so forth. Why should I have to rewrite that for every single object that I make? I shouldn't. So I can link it using what's called prototype, a shared object. So now I'm going to target my apple object. And when I've targeted my apple object, I'm going to call the throw method. How does this work? Well, what JavaScript does is it's very clever, and it goes and grabs the apple object, as you would expect. But then it tries to look for the throw method. It tries to look for that key name. It won't find it in the apple object. It's not there. But JavaScript's clever. It goes, wait a minute, we have a shared object associated. Then what it does is it goes to the shared object, the prototype object. It's a shared object. Is there any key name in here called throw? JavaScript looks through that shared object. Ah, there it is. And then it simply runs the function. Very simple, and this is very powerful. So you can see here that all prototype is just a shared object. That's all you have to think about it, is just a shared object. But why is it so important? Well, it allows us to control our code a lot more. Let's say, for example, now that I have 3 apples. So having one apple in a shared object is pretty much a waste of time. But let's say I have 3 apples now, and they all have a link to that prototype object, that shared object. So now my apples potentially could have different properties. They could be different apples, essentially, different sizes, different colors, different shapes. It doesn't matter. But what they all have in common is the shared object. And the shared object has all of the methods, the functions that we can run on each one of those apples or those apple objects. So each one of those apples, I could say, get that apple and run the eat method. So I can eat that specific apple, or I could throw that specific apple. But however, what it's doing is it's not calling that function directly from the object. It's looking down the prototype chain and it's saying, aha, there's the function. This is what makes prototype so powerful. Now, if you can imagine, I have thousands of apples. Could you imagine trying to replicate the same amount of methods over and over and over and over and over again for each apple? There are ways to create an object dynamically. We will look at that later. But the reason why this is so beneficial is because we're not doing that. We're not repeating ourselves over and over and over again. Because when you are repeating yourself over and over again, you need more memory to store those methods. So why do this? Why take up more memory than what you have to? The answer is you shouldn't. And that's why it's very good for us as programmers. It takes up less memory, and also I have one object that I can manage instead of thousands of instances of those methods being generated all over the shop. I keep it neat, I keep it compact, and I keep it slim. Now let's replicate our example into code. And that way we can really delve into this, learn about the syntax of JavaScript, and understand the prototype chain a lot more. So first of all, whenever you create an object, whether it be an array or a standard object, there is automatically a shared object that's attached onto it. And JavaScript does this automatically. It's nothing that you do. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call it obj. So I'm creating an empty box, and then I'm going to create an object within the empty box. Now let's open up the window object and take a look at my empty box. So let's scroll down. And we should be able to see in here obj. Now notice my object did not have any properties. I didn't create any properties. This is an empty object. But you'll notice we have this object, which is __proto__. Proto is short for prototype. And the reason why we have these underscores in here is because you shouldn't really access this. However, what's in here is the prototype object. So you can see here we have define getter, define setter, and so forth. And when you'll notice that when I say obj dot, the browser brings up all of this list of properties and methods. And these properties and methods come from the shared object. They come from the __proto__object. It's a shared object. And JavaScript knows about this shared object. But now let's say that what I want to do is very quickly collapse this all up so I get a bit more real estate space. Let's create an object. And I want to create the Apple object. So in fact, what we'll do is we'll create an entirely new object called Apple. And now what I want to do is, let's say, define some properties on here. Color is red. So we're defining some nouns, and we'll say width is 200 and the height is 350. Simple object, just full of properties. Now when I open up window, we can take a look at my Apple right here. So I can scroll right down. And then we have Apple. We have the color, the height, the width, and you'll also notice there's the prototype object. So you can see that whenever you create an object, even if it's a standard object, or if it's an array, and you'll see the array one later, it's attaching a shared object automatically. It does this automatically, but we can actually manipulate this object right here. We can change it, even though you shouldn't. However, I will, because we are learning. So we have our main Apple object, and we have our prototype object. Now what I want to do is say Apple dot __proto. Now you'll notice it didn't list out this and say __. The reason why it doesn't want you modifying this is because if you change this shared object, you could end up doing stuff that you don't want to do. And on top of that, it is very, very slow when you do this. But if I hit return, you will notice that it will return the prototype object like so. Very, very easy. So if you ever want to find out what's the shared object, what methods, what information does it contain, just type in your object and then say dot __proto__. And you will be able to see that object and take a look at all of the available methods to you and properties. Whatever properties and methods are in the proto object will also be available to you directly. So I can say apple dot define __, define getter __. So you'll immediately see that's right there. I can access that, even though you shouldn't, because again, it has that __. Wherever you see __, you shouldn't really access it. You shouldn't try either changing it or accessing it. However, you can. So now let's modify this prototype object, this shared object. And I'm going to say underscore underscore proto underscore underscore, and then we're going to add a new property on here. We're going to create a new property in this shared object. And I'm going to say hello and give it a string. World. Why not? All right, so now let's take a look at the window object again. And scroll all the way down. And let's take a look at this object that was created. We have Apple, which has the same properties. It didn't add a property onto this object. It didn't add the hello property here. It added it to the proto object, the prototype object. And voila, hello world. Easy. Now, let's go ahead and call the hello property. Apple dot, and you'll notice it's listed here. Hello. JavaScript was smart, it realized what it was. And there you go, it returns world. So what did it do there? It looked at the Apple object, which has these three properties on here, still has those three properties directly associated with it. However, it doesn't have the hello property. So what it did was, it looked at that object, and then it looked at the proto object, the shared object associated with it. And then once it did that, which I can say apple dot underscore proto, like so, it looked at this object, and now you'll notice it says hello. So it goes, it wasn't directly here, but now what I'm going to do is look for that property in the prototype object. And guess what? It found it and returned the string world. Very easy and very simple. It's just a shared object. Now here is why you don't want to do this. The reason being is because now I've affected every single object that I will create in this window in this particular instance. So for example, if I refresh the page, everything will go back to normal. But whilst I have this session going in the browser, this web page is still open and still active, and it's the exact same one, I can create a new object. Let's say test. And now I can refer to test and say dot, and you'll notice hello is there. So I've now affected the shared object, the default shared object associated with every single object. That's why you shouldn't do it. But you will notice it will say world, the string that I put in that property. So there you go. It does work. Now I can use this to my advantage for the teaching purposes. Let's go ahead and take a look at Apple again. So we have the variable Apple, and it has the color of red, width, and height. Perfectly fine. Now let's repeat it, and I'm going to create an Apple 2. And let's just change the dimensions, and it's going to be a green apple as well. And then we're going to have a third apple. So we're replicating my example that I showed you, and we'll pop this red, and we'll say 100, and let's say it's going to be 150. I have 3 apples, 3 whole apples, and with each one, I can reference each one, apple dot hello. That's the shared property, don't forget. Apple 2, same thing. Apple 3, same thing. No problems there. Now let's say that I change the first apple. I say, right, go grab that box. I don't need var in there, but I'll leave it in there anyway, it doesn't matter. And I want to delete whatever is inside of that box, and then put in that new box an object. And what I want to do is create a new property called hello. So now we have a potential conflict. And I'm going to say apple hello. What will this do? That's the question. What will it do? Will it affect Apple 2 and Apple 3 when I call the hello property? The answer is no. Let's go ahead and grab Apple. So this is this apple right here, and say dot hello. What's it going to fetch? Is it going to fetch this hello? Let's find out. It did. It fetched this hello. So what JavaScript does is it looks at the object first. It looks at this object and says, can I find that property? Which it did. If it doesn't initially find the property in this object, it then looks in the prototype object. However, in this instance, it didn't need to do that. What it did was it stopped right here. It didn't bother looking in the prototype object. It says, I found it. Everything stops and it just returns that string. Has it affected any of the other apples? Apple2 dot hello. Let's take a look. Apple2 dot hello returns world. So Apple2 does not have the hello property immediately found. So it looks inside of the prototype object and says, now I've found it. Then it returns the world string. And the same goes for Apple3. Apple3 dot hello will return you world. Again, it's looking at the prototype object. Very basic and very simple. If it finds the property, it doesn't delete the prototype. It doesn't do anything like that. It doesn't reassign the value to prototype. All it does is it creates it directly. And if JavaScript sees this property directly in the object, it stops. But if it doesn't find it, then it will look in the prototype object. And it will look inside of that prototype object for hello, and it will find it. It will go, okay, it's not here, so now I'm going to look in the prototype. But it only does that if it finds it just before, it stops there. But if it doesn't find it, then it looks, and then it pulls out what you're expecting. Now, very quickly, I wanted to talk with you about arrays and showing you how they're different from regular objects. Now, arrays are objects. However, they come with more methods to organize the data. So I can create an array, and I'll just create an empty array like so. So when I call ARR, it won't have anything associated with it. It's just an empty array. If I open up the window object and then I go ahead and take a look at it, let's go to ARR, and inside of there, you'll notice all it has is the length property, and that will return 0. If I now take a look at the prototype object, you will notice we have a lot more functionality than a standard object. This is because an array is a register. It's a zero-index register, and each element, each piece of data in the array, which we call an element, has an index. And what we can do is we can call upon these functions and we can reorganize the data, and it keeps the data registered with a correct index. And so this can be very, very useful when your applications need to be very, very structurally sound at some points. Let's take a look at the push method. Just as an example, the push method simply takes a value and pushes it, inserts it into the array. So let's go ahead and close that up. I'm going to say ARR.push. This is now looking at the push method in the prototype object because it's not going to find it directly on the object. Don't forget, all that had was the .length property. So JavaScript is going to say, well, I didn't see it directly in the array object. Now I'm going to go to the prototype object associated with it. Now we have a function. If I just type this in, it will return the function. But I don't want to return the function, I want to run the function. So we open and close the brackets. This says run that function. And we need to assign a parameter to an argument. And this parameter could be, let's say, a number, a string, or anything you wanted to push into the array. So I'll just say hello. Now when I call my array, you will notice what it did was it took that parameter and it takes that value and it pushes it into our empty array. And now we have the string hello. So there is a classic example of what prototype does and why it's so useful. And every single array you create will have the push method, will have the concat method, will have this, will have that. So you have that same functionality across all of your array objects. This is why it's powerful, and we can use this to our advantage.